My name is Emily Rains. For most of my life, that name meant very little to the people who were supposed to know me best. To my parents, I was the quiet one, the background noise in a family that celebrated noise. To my sister Amanda, I was the footnote to her highlight reel. They all believed they knew who I was. Today, in a federal courtroom packed with spectators and press, they were about to find out how wrong they'd been. I walked into the courtroom slowly, deliberately, every step as silent as the breathless tension in the air. Amanda sat at the defense table, her signature smug smile untouched by the gravity of the fraud charges hanging over her. She didn't look worried. Of course she didn't. She was still the star in their eyes. My parents sat right behind her, dressed in their best outfits, the kind they wore to donor galas and country club mixers. They didn't see me at first. When they finally did, my mother's expression flickered with confusion, then quickly smoothed over with practiced politeness. My father didn't even blink. I wasn't there for them. They thought I'd come to support Amanda, or maybe to spectate like some distant cousin. The same role I'd always played. They couldn't imagine another reason I would walk through those heavy courtroom doors. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. The energy shifted like the air had thickened. I remained standing, my suit, sharp, my badge visible, but subtle. The judge glanced at the papers in front of her, her voice calm but commanding. She scanned the room and said the words that broke everything open. The court acknowledges the presence of lead federal prosecutor Emily Rains' Department of Justice. The sound hit like a dropped weight. My name, my full title, delivered with all the gravity the bench could offer. I didn't look at my family. I didn't have to. The silence said it all. Amanda's smirk had vanished, replaced by a blank stare and a tightening jaw. My mother's hand flew to her necklace, her mouth slightly parted. My father's shoulders stiffened, his gaze locked forward but vacant. They were still trying to process what they'd just heard. I walked to my designated seat in the front row, reserved for official counsel. Every step felt like reclaiming a decade. I sat with calm, my back straight, my hands folded neatly. Around me, murmurs began to ripple across the room. A few journalists scribbled notes faster, and a couple of attorneys glanced my way with sudden recognition. The judge tapped her gavel once, restoring quiet. Amanda turned slightly, trying to catch my eye, but the dynamic had shifted. Her world, the one she built on charm and manipulation, no longer held the power. Mine did. I didn't blink. I gave her nothing. My name was in the official record. My rank was not up for debate. The courtroom knew it. Soon the world would too. But what no one in that room could see, not the judge, not the media, not even Amanda, was that this story didn't start here. It started years earlier around a dinner table, with a lie that seemed harmless at the time. A lie that shaped everything that followed. A lie she told to keep herself on top. And I let her. Until now. Amanda was everything I wasn't. At least, that's how it always felt growing up. She was the golden child, the one people turned toward when she entered a room, as if she carried light with her. Tall, effortlessly elegant, with that kind of laugh that made people lean in. She didn't just know how to work a room, she owned it. My parents adored her, not in the quiet, unconditional way some families love, but in the loud, performative way that demanded applause. Every family dinner turned into a tribute to Amanda's latest success. If it wasn't a new client or a luxury vacation, it was her networking at some prestigious event. My father would toast her with his wine glass raised high, proud, like she'd just cured a disease. My mother would reach across the table, eyes wide, lips parted in delight, hanging on every polished word Amanda spoke. When it was my turn to speak, the tone shifted. The spotlight dimmed. My updates were met with mild nods and half smiles, followed by someone changing the subject back to Amanda. I could have said I'd won an award or run a marathon. It wouldn't have mattered. If Amanda had posted a new photo with the right filter and caption, it would have stolen the conversation before I'd even finished my sentence. Holidays were the worst. Amanda gave expensive gifts with elaborate wrapping and personalized notes. I brought simple, thoughtful things, books I'd loved, Framed pictures, things I'd made time for. They were barely opened. I started leaving the price tags on just to see if it changed anything. It didn't. She was the success story. I was in the background. She walked through life as if it were a stage set just for her. I stood in the wings unseen. And the worst part? She knew it. She leaned into it. There were times she'd glance at me during a conversation with that look, the one that said, "Sorry you couldn't quite keep up. Sorry you were never meant to." Everyone believed Amanda had it all together. But what they didn't realize was that her entire persona was a performance one carefully curated for applause. They never questioned what she covered up with that charm. They never questioned what it cost me to stay silent while she played the star. The story Amanda told was simple. I had dropped out of school, couldn't keep up, and ended up waiting tables to get by. She delivered it like she was sharing a family tragedy, softened with a sympathetic smile, but always loud enough for the room to hear. She said it at brunch with relatives, slipped it into conversations with family friends, and even joked about it during holidays. What stung wasn't just the lie. It was how easily everyone believed it. There were no questions, no doubts. No one who pulled me aside to ask if it was true. In their eyes, it made sense. I had never shown off, never competed for attention. I was quiet, private. A blank canvas that Amanda painted her version of failure on, and no one thought to wipe it clean. They started saying things that stuck like splinters. At least she's working. At least she's not a burden. At least she's not still trying to make something of herself. It became the family's quiet comfort, this story of my failure. It let them continue praising Amanda without guilt. It let them sit in their illusion that the family's success rested on her shoulders alone. What they didn't know was that at the same time Amanda was laughing about my so-called mistakes, I was at the DOJ Academy. Training. Studying harder than I ever have. Learning how to handle high-level cases, gathering evidence, and briefing real agents. But that life was classified, buried under layers of clearance, and I couldn't talk about it, not to them, not to anyone. So I let the lie live. Not because I believed it, but because fighting it would have exposed things I wasn't allowed to share. And because deep down I knew they wouldn't have listened anyway. They liked the version of me that failed. It made them comfortable. It kept Amanda elevated. It gave them a neat little story to explain why I wasn't shining the way they thought I should. It hurt. Every silent dinner, every side-eye when someone mentioned law school, every time I saw my parents beam when Amanda walked into a room and barely glanced up when I did. It dug deep. But it also hardened something in me. I learned how to keep going without claps, how to find pride in private victories, how to define my own worth when no one else would. I used to replay that moment in my head, what it would feel like to finally speak the truth, to correct the record, to take back my name. But when the time came, I didn't need to say a word. All I had to do was show up. The lie Amanda built for me had served her well for years. But the truth I carried in silence had more power than any story ever could. The first time I stepped into the secure wing of the DOJ building, I knew I'd never forget the sound of the door locking behind me. It wasn't loud, but it meant everything. Past that door, I wasn't Amanda's overlooked sister or my parents' quiet disappointment. I was someone with clearance, someone trusted to handle the kinds of truths the world didn't get to see. My office wasn't glamorous. No windows, no polished wood furniture, just metal monitors and a digital hum that never stopped. But in that room, decisions were made that carried real weight. I combed through surveillance logs, tracked financial trails, and spotted patterns that others missed. I briefed agents, advised on risk, and drafted reports that shaped legal action. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines, but holds real power. There was one case I remember clearly, a multinational shell company masking funds through layered transactions. It looked clean at first glance, but something about the timestamps didn't add up. I spent a weekend rerunning queries, isolating inconsistencies, and building a report that ended up redirecting the entire investigation. The head of my division nodded once quietly, and that was all the recognition I needed. That was my world. Measured, serious, exact. The stakes were national, sometimes international. Every file I touched, every decision I made had consequences. There was no room for showmanship, no filters or champagne toasts, just truth, process, and accountability. Meanwhile, Amanda was being toasted at luncheons for closing real estate deals she barely understood. Her Instagram was a highlight reel of staged success rooftop selfies, designer handbags, buzzwords wrapped in captions. People applauded her not for what she did, but for how she made them feel about it. She was a brand. I was working. At family events, they saw the surface. Amanda wore confidence like a crown. I wore quiet like armor. They never saw what was behind it. They didn't know that while they mocked my silence, I was briefing federal agents on how to dismantle money laundering networks. There were nights I went home exhausted, mentally spent eyes dry from hours of screen time and documentation. And then I'd scroll past Amanda's latest post with hundreds of likes. I'd feel that old sting, that pressure in my chest, and then I'd let it go. Because I knew that while she curated perception, I was influencing action. They thought I was a failure eatheting. But the truth was, I had simply learned to live in a world where value isn't worn, it's earned. And mine had been earned 10 times over. Coach Grant was the only one who ever really saw me. Not just the quiet girl in the background, but the mind behind the silence. He used to be a friend of my dad's back when I was still in school, back when I hadn't figured out how to carry myself yet. My dad introduced him like a golf buddy. I never told anyone that Coach Grant saw something in me. My own father never did. He asked questions no one else asked. Not about my plans, but about how I thought. About what I noticed. About what bothered me. He wasn't trying to steer me anywhere. He just listened. And then one day he handed me an old DOJ report and said, "I want you to read this and tell me what's missing." I spent 3 hours on that report, not because I had to, but because I wanted to know the pattern. I brought it back with 3 pages of notes and a flowchart I had drawn by hand. He read them all in silence. When he finished, he looked at me like he already knew the answer. He said, "You don't need a bigger voice, Emily. You just need the right room." He opened that room for me, quietly. No favors, no shortcuts. Just the right names whispered in the right places, the right files passed along. He coached me through applications, gave feedback on my case analysis. And when I got into the DOJ Academy, he was the first one I called. Not my parents. Not Amanda. Just him. There was a case early in my career that almost broke me. Too big, too fast. I was drowning in spreadsheets and inconsistencies I couldn't untangle. I stayed late for a week straight. Coach Grant showed up one night without warning, pulled up a chair and sat with me until sunrise. He never touched the files. He didn't give me answers. He just stayed. After that case broke open, I found out he'd gone to the deputy director himself, vouched for me, and said I was the best analyst they had coming up. I never knew until someone told me in passing at a briefing. That was how he moved. Always behind the curtain, making sure I got seen. He believed in me before I had anything to show, before the rank, before the courtroom. He reminded me that quiet wasn't weakness. It was precision, and that in the right hands could change everything. Coach Grant gave me what my family never did. Not praise, not pride, just presence. The kind that says I know who you are. You don't have to prove it. The case landed on my desk like any other. A string of suspicious contracts, offshore transfers, and a consulting firm funneling payments through shell corporations. I'd seen variations of this playbook before. It was technical, tedious, the kind of puzzle I usually enjoyed picking apart. I skimmed the overview, flagged a few anomalies, then flipped to the appendix. That's where the name hit me like a punch to the chest. Amanda Raines Holdings. For a second, I stared at the page thinking it had to be a coincidence. It wasn't. The details matched. Addresses, registration dates, and even her signature on the vendor filings. My pulse spiked. But my face didn't move. I closed the folder, leaned back in my chair, and let the weight of it settle. My first instinct was to walk it straight to my supervisor. Recuse myself, wash my hands, keep my world separate. That was how I'd survived this long. Boundaries, distance. But this time was different. This time the lines weren't just crossing, they were colliding. I pulled the file back out and flipped through every page slowly, not as Amanda's sister, but as a federal prosecutor. I examined it like I would any case. Pattern recognition, motive, gaps. I didn't look for innocence or guilt. I looked for the truth. That night, I stayed late. I reviewed vendor lists, mapped transaction chains, and ran secondary searches through the DOJ systems. The deeper I went, the more obvious the scheme became. Inflated invoices, dummy contractors. Money moved just enough to feel clean, but not enough to hide completely. It was sloppy work dressed up in branding and buzzwords. At no point did I feel angry. That surprised me. There was no betrayal, no family drama playing in the back of my mind. What I felt was clarity. Amanda had built a life on perception. I had built one on facts. This case wasn't about sisters. It was about right and wrong. The next morning, I scheduled a quiet meeting with my director. I explained the connection. I told her I understood what it meant. She asked if I could remain objective. I said yes because I knew the stakes and I knew myself. She nodded once, and that was that. Staying on the case wasn't vengeance. It was discipline. It was duty. If Amanda had crossed into my world, then she had done so with her eyes open. The consequences didn't come from me. They came from her choices. I was simply the one with the flashlight. The courtroom had that heavy stillness only federal trials carry. The air was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs. Amanda sat straight at the defense table, perfectly composed in her expensive suit legs, crossed expression calm. She hadn't seen me enter. Neither had my parents. They were seated directly behind her, talking in whispers, eyes skimming the room like they belonged there. I stood to the side in uniform badge, visible expression unreadable. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge stepped in with practiced authority. She scanned the paperwork, adjusted her glasses, and read the line that changed everything. Lead Federal Prosecutor Emily Raines, Department of Justice, present and observing. My name dropped into the room like a stone in still water. Amanda's head jerked toward the sound. My mother's hand twitched at her lap, frozen mid-gesture. My father blinked once, twice, and then sat motionless. No one said a word. Their eyes found me slowly, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Amanda's mouth parted, but no words came. That poised mask she wore cracked at the edges. Her confidence had no place to go. My parents didn't look at her. They were looking at me now, like they were trying to do math in their heads and failing. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The judge acknowledged my presence with a respectful nod. To everyone else, it was a formality. To my family, it was a reckoning. Every story they'd ever told about me collapsed in that single moment. The failed waitress, the dropout, the quiet disappointment. All of it swept away by one title they had never imagined attached to my name. I sat down quietly in the front row of the prosecutor's section. From that seat, I could see them all. Amanda frozen. My father is pale. My mother is shrinking into herself. No one dared look away. The courtroom wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence was louder than anything they'd ever said to me. And in that silence, I felt something shift, not just in the room, but in me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I had already proven it, without their permission, without their applause. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and they finally knew it. Amanda was convicted on all counts. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The charges were serious and the evidence spoke louder than anything she or her lawyers tried to spin. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a public dismantling of the persona she had spent years building. The media had a field day. But I stayed quiet. I didn't give interviews. I didn't celebrate. I just went back to work. A few weeks after the trial, my mother started calling. I let it go to voicemail. Then the texts came. At first, they were short. Are you okay? We should talk. Then one day my phone buzzed and kept buzzing. It was a message long enough to be a letter. From her. Full of soft language and slippery phrasing. She said they had no idea. Amanda said she lied to them too. Said they always believed I had potential, even if they didn't show it well. Said they were proud of me now. It ended with 5 words I had once begged to hear. We are so proud of you. I read it twice, not because I didn't believe it, but because I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger. Just a blank, quiet space where pain used to live. The ache was gone. The need for their approval had vanished. It had taken years of silence, years of doing the work without applause, but I had finally reached the place where their words didn't land anymore. I didn't reply. I didn't feel cruel for that. I just understood that sometimes closure doesn't come from a conversation. It comes from growth, from truth. Finally, knowing your value doesn't depend on whether someone else sees it. That afternoon, I was back in my office. My new office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that stretches past the city. My team was gathered around the conference table reviewing details for a new case. They were sharp, curious, and relentless. I watched them talk, interrupt, challenge each other the way real teams do. I realized they weren't just colleagues. They were my people, my family. I glanced at the text again, hovering at the top of my phone screen. My thumb moved slowly, then tapped archive. Not delete, not block. Just out of sight. Filed away with everything else I no longer needed. The work was waiting, and I had never felt more ready to return to it. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. Some end with truth and distance and peace. And sometimes that's more than enough. Because at the end of the day, what matters isn't the story they told about you, it's the one you lived. And lived well.